Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to go ahead and check out the interview between Dr. K and Diary of a CEO. Obviously, this is a video that came out a little bit ago and it sparked a lot of heat around Dr. K and his pitch as to what's going on with men. Naturally, we're not going to check out the whole 2-hour long video, but we will check out a couple snippets that involve what is a man and his definition, as well as what's going on with them and what's wrong with them. Obviously, this is in lieu of the channel, so I figured we'd check it out and give our thoughts. I've never seen any of Diary of a CEO's content, so this will be a first. Without further ado, let's get into it.
You used the word losers there, and you did little air quotes for anyone that can't see you right now. I'm really interested when you talked about incels as well, whether the way society is and the way that we're heading in terms of clarity over what it is to be a man has had any impact on those people that you referred to as incels. Like because we now have this digital world that we can live our lives in as a distraction from the real world. And there's now more confusion than ever over what it is to be a man and the role of a man in and then we look at the stats around suicidality. And I think in Europe, the biggest killer of men under the age of 45 is themselves currently. Mm-hmm. Is the shifting idea of what it is to be a man having an impact on people's sense of self and their purpose?
100%. So there's a crisis that's going on in men, and people think that this is new, but I don't think it's new. It's always been there. So if you look at even 50, 60 years ago, 80% of suicides are still going to be men. So historically, men have been killing themselves for 100 years, and no one's been paying attention. We're just noticing now because the problem seems to be getting worse. So there's a couple of things that are really interesting to understand. So one is that if we look at what technology is doing to our brains, the first thing that it's doing is it is externalizing our attention. So if you look back, let's say 1,000 years ago, as human beings, we spent a lot more time with ourselves. So let's say that you and I go out hunting, and then let's say you shoot an arrow at a deer and you miss, and then I shoot an arrow at a deer and I hit. So in this moment, I'm superior to you. And then we pick up the deer and we're carrying it back. And then we have about 2 or 3 hours to take that emotional insult and we kind of process it. We just give our mind space to process it, which it does automatically. Now, if you look at what happens in people's days, they don't actually have any time to process what happens to them because we are so constantly distracted by external things. So I don't know if you're like this, but I was in this point where I was idiotically efficient. So I would wake up in the morning and I would listen to a podcast.
Well, with that being said, it's also a matter of us seeking those distractions as well, because often when we incite a feeling of failure, it's not that it's just magically there. We're actually actively seeking it out as well because we're being cowardly in the face of our shame, in the face of our guilt for our failure. And that's a better way for us to handle it, because if we can gauge a sense of distraction, that allows us to escape the environmental context of the failure that we feel. And it allows us to jump into this new environmental context where our attention can be completely devoid of value, i.e. social media, video games, whatever, without ever giving the failure a chance to have a learning orientation, which is very important because we often are overly concerned with performative goals and not learning goals. And because we're overly concerned with performative goals, if we don't come out on top, we just take it as an L regardless. We don't take it as something to learn from and to process. No, we just kind of escape, quit, and then distract, and then come back to the world like it didn't happen because shame doesn't feel good, or it doesn't feel as good as it does to be completely devoid of focus.
While I'm doing my exercise or whatever, and then even when I'm cooking, I'm listening to a lecture. And then when I'm walking to the train, I have earbuds in and I'm listening to a lecture there. On the train, I'm reading. I wanted my life to be completely efficient. I didn't want to waste a single moment.
I literally listen to the news in the shower.
Right? So we don't want to waste time. And so if you really think about it, where's the attention of your mind? Your mind is pointed outside of you. And so then what happens is once we do not pay attention to ourselves, we lose sight of our internal signals. Literally in the same way that if you raise a child in a dark cave, the photoreceptors in their eyes won't develop. They will atrophy. So anything that the mind does not get access to will start to atrophy. If I don't practice Spanish, I'm going to forget Spanish. The brain is a very efficient organ. So as we externalize our attention, we lose sight of our internal signals. We don't know who we are anymore. And now if I don't know who I am, how do I figure out who I'm supposed to be? I pay attention to the outside. Where are the answers? They're on the outside. So this person is talking about masculinity. This person is talking about what it means to be a man. This person is talking about what it means to be a man. And now since I don't have any internal source of information, I'm trying to figure out what it means to be a man from the outside world. And this is when men get truly fucked, because what it means to be a man, we are getting all kinds of mixed signals. So on the one hand, it means being physically fit. On the other hand, it means being a provider. On one hand, it means having sex with as many women as you can find. On the other hand, it means having sex with just one woman and being a really solid man and being a good father. And then there's also people telling us that being a man means that you're shit, right? That you're toxic, that your testosterone level makes you violent, that you're...
These are one of the things I was talking about during the red pill, because obviously the red pill had this great intention at the start. For anyone that hasn't seen my video, it turned into this diabolical thing. And I think that when men fail to realize their own internal signals, they become sheep-like. They become even more impressionable than they were before, and they become dangerously impressionable at that, because your upbringing needs to be a system of conscience, and you need to be fully aware of self the whole time you're traversing. And if you don't, it's no wonder why we become beings that have a hard time handling anxiety. And if we don't learn to deal with panic, then we will never learn how it is to be resilient. And if we do not achieve resiliency, then we will never establish a sustainable efficacy for us to travel life. Life is hard. Life is rough. Life is not fair. And we don't have time to constantly internalize these attentive factors to things outside of ourselves. When that is a constant, the world is going to continue to be hard. It's not going to just lighten up on men. It's going to get worse.
Evil, that you're privileged, that there's a patriarchy, all this kind of stuff. So we're getting all this information from the outside about what it means to be a man. And so
what's crazy is that every single one of his scenarios is hard. Every single thing is hard. Even the one that demasculinizes men, it's still hard, because you're destroying that man's life and perspective of self by saying that he's already all these evil things. He's already tyrannical and he's already this terrible being. Now deal with it. It's just like, that's hard too. But then achieving the goals in the other areas, that takes diligence, that takes true hard work and dedication of self. And that's hard too. It's hard all the way around.
like there are all kinds of interesting ramifications of this. So men in today's society are not allowed to complain. So if you complain and you're a successful person or a privileged person,
that's not just today's society. It's always been that way.
Everyone is going to think you're arrogant. Everyone is going to think, oh my God, who's this fucking guy? This guy doesn't know what my life is like. How does he have any right to complain? And even your mind will tell you this. You'll look at these people and you'll be like, yeah, I don't have a right to complain. But now we need to stop for a second and think about what it does to your psychology when you as a human being are not allowed to articulate your suffering. I've worked with people who've grown up in abusive households where children will say to their parents, Mommy, Daddy, I'm hurting. And the parent smacks them across the face. How dare you? You're so lucky. You don't realize the sacrifices I make for you. It's traumatizing to the child when they say, I am suffering, and no one listens. This is what we're doing to the generation of men. People are saying, I am suffering. For 100 years, men have been killing themselves. 80% of suicides are men. The most dangerous thing for a man under 45 is themselves. And these people have been literally killing themselves because no one has been listening to them. So in the same way that you grow up with as a child in a household that's abusive, where no one takes you seriously, no one listens to your suffering, and now we even have successful men who are not allowed to complain. So the psychological impact is the same. Anytime you have a human being who is suffering in some way and they cannot find connection with another human being, they cannot find compassion with another human being, that person is going to feel isolated. And if you look at the statistics on suicide, it's very interesting. So the number one thing that correlates with male suicide is not depression, and this is super scary. There's one study I saw recently that suggests that 50% of men who kill themselves have no history or evidence of mental illness. And this, I believe the statistic in my clinical practice, because I know what depression looks like. I know what bipolar disorder looks like. And half the men that I've worked with, at least, are not actually mentally ill. See, mental illness means a pathology of the mind, which means that the mind is malfunctioning. Most of the suicidal men that I work with, their mind isn't malfunctioning. They genuinely have a life.
What he's saying is that there's actual biological deficiencies and differences between your brain and that of a brain that is navigating a mental disorder. That means different sizes of certain lobes. That means different levels of activity depending on what portion of the brain that we're talking about. It could be lower activity of neurotransmitters. Basically, the activity of biological hormones that allows us to feel, allows us to act, allows us to be attentive, focus, arouse, whatever. There's literal massive differences between what's going on in their brain, not just thoughts, what's going on physically, biologically, chemically, in their brain that is significantly different than just the person that's having a hard time. You're not mentally ill. Just because you can't handle stress, that doesn't mean that you're mentally ill. But what typically happens is that they use this as a scapegoat for destructive tendencies and impulsive behavior, not realizing that you just never learn to handle anything. You never learn to be resilient. You never learn a sustainable version of you to be able to weather these storms that you're constantly going in. Why? Because externalizing factors. I think he hit the nail right on the point when he started off of why it is that men are drowning. Well, they never learned to swim.
That is no longer worth living. They're looking at things and objectively realizing that there's no way out of this situation. So they turn to suicide. So I know it's kind of like a very controversial statement, but I think that's what my clinical practice has shown, and there's some research to even back that up. So if we sort of look at what's going on with men, we're sort of, they have nowhere to turn to. And the number one thing that correlates with it is not mental illness, but is a sense of thwarted belongingness. So this is kind of like multivariate regression analysis. But basically what happens is what causes people to kill themselves is they try to connect with others and they get rejected. So it's specifically a very specific research term called thwarted belongingness. So I try to belong to a group, and that group, or multiple groups usually, will thwart my attempts to join the tribe, to join the community. And this is what actually correlates a lot with suicidality. So what's going on with men right now is that we really don't allow them to suffer, because then you're not manly. And we're so externalized with our attention that we're not connecting with ourselves. And so we're looking to other people to tell us what it means to be a man. But that may or may not work for you, right? That may have been what worked for them.
That's also a product of fatherlessness because we allow the impression of other people to mean more than what goes on in our own home. And it doesn't mean that if a father's there, okay, it's all good. That's obviously a bit anecdotal, but on average, it's better. That's not to say that every father is good, because you can have fathers in the home that just they didn't fulfill the requirements necessary in order to be prepared to be a father, and that's actually kind of part of the problem too.
So then we kind of get into this problem where we're disconnected from ourselves, and then the world doesn't accept us, we're not allowed to suffer, and that's what creates the problem.
What is the remedy to this?
So I think the first thing is we must reconnect with ourselves, right? So when you're kind of saying why does everyone think, oh, I need to achieve this, I need to make this money and things like that. Where did you learn that you should do all that? You learned all that from the outside. Instagram, right? So we get fed all of these ideas because if you look at all these influencers, what are they doing? They're never crying. They're smiling. Some of them will even pay very attractive women to take pictures with them.
Well, some of them are crying, but they're crying and uploading it for ulterior motives, right?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of them are genuinely suffering too. But then it's also there's all kinds of weird stuff going on. So one thing is people say that we don't allow men to be emotional. Nowadays, but people say, oh, men are allowed to cry. So this is something that I experienced even in my marriage.
But it's counterintuitive because you have the same amount of people saying not to.
Where we allow men to cry, but we don't allow men to be angry. But why are men no longer allowed to be angry? You just think about it for a second. So anger is just a completely normal emotion, right? But if I'm in a situation where I'm in an argument with my wife, and I feel emotion A, and I express emotion A, and she feels emotion B, and she expresses emotion B. These two things should be equal, right? We as both human beings get to express what we feel. Now, in the case of me expressing anger and her expressing sadness, she's crying and I'm yelling. Suddenly, I become a villain.
It's so interesting. I saw a viral tweet yesterday. It was someone Googling, my wife is yelling at me, what should I do? And then my husband is yelling at me, what should I do? When they Googled, my husband is yelling at me, what should I do? Domestic violence helpline comes up as like a Google pop-up. When you Google, my wife is yelling at me, what should I do? Nothing comes up.
Yeah.
Because obviously, as you said, in the case of villainization, I know that most domestic violence comes from men, but it's interesting that we see the emotion.
Most reported domestic violence comes from men. Violence, if measured in its entirety, that is no longer the case. This is actually something that I covered a bit of time ago, but if you covered relational violence, so in other words, infidelity or relationship manipulation, it's no longer the case that men lead in violence. They lead in aggressive physical violence. And that's still even kind of iffy because when men are attacked, they don't report. When women are attacked, they're more likely to report, and hence the outcome. It's still a statistic that's still very flawed, and I think there should be some new stuff on it.
We interpret the emotions entirely differently because of that.
Absolutely, right? So we as a society will say like, oh, men need to be in touch with their emotions, but not anger. And then this is what really screws men, because as men, we are socialized and conditioned to only feel anger. This is the only emotion you are allowed to feel as a man growing up. And this is the one emotion that gets demonized when you're older. So I'll give you a simple example. So like I used to get bullied a lot, right? So when I get bullied in school, like what am I supposed to do, Stephen?
In school, well, it depends if you can fight back.
Absolutely, right? It's fighting back. Like you didn't say talk to the teacher. You didn't say ask for help. You didn't say cry about it, because if I cry about it, what's going to happen, Stephen?
You're going to get bullied more.
Absolutely. So we turn every emotion. So men experience anger as something called an umbrella emotion. We literally suppress and are conditioned to suppress all other emotions.
That's because if men enact their weaknesses, they're more likely to become a victim that people will feel less compassion for. Women, on the other hand, if they end up being a victim, there's going to be a lot of compassion flocking to women for several reasons. But when men try to victimize themselves or enact their victimhood, blood in the water.
Except for anger. And then if you talk to men about their experience of life, anger is always the first thing that comes out of their mouth. Someone breaks up with you, how do you feel about it? Do you feel ashamed? No, that's not what we say. I feel pissed off. How could she do this to me? And then we vent that anger on the internet, and then this turns into misogyny, right? And then we get demonized for it. And it's not that there isn't, we should be harshly judged if we act on those kinds of emotions. I'm not saying that that's the case. But what we also need to consider is that the men who are saying these kinds of toxic things are saying that for a reason. This is because of their upbringing. This is because of the world that they lived in, right? So we're conditioned to only experience anger. Even sadness gets turned into anger. Shame gets turned into anger. Fear gets turned into anger, right? So if I'm afraid of something happening, what do I need? I need to man up, get angry, right? Like, let's go, son, let's go. This is the emotion that we tap into to overcome fear. So we don't feel any of those other emotions, and we're left only feeling anger.
At the very heart,
I think it's not the fact that we're doing it to overcome it. It's just that we're irritated with our inability and inferiority of being able to accomplish or even work through these other feelings. I think that when we feel a sense of insecurity, we get angry because if we don't know how to navigate our own emotions, and hence, like I've said previously, is that we are not emotionally resilient, we're just going to be upset at our inability to navigate that emotion every single time. And that ends up being the outcome because it's anger that we know. We know how to enact ourselves in a physically violent way or even a verbally violent way. That's very natural. But if, like how we go back to the start of this, if we externalize everything and we never learn how to deal with inferiority, insecurity, sadness, fear, nervousness, right? Anxiety, stress. If we never learn how to deal with these things and all we know is aggression, sure, we're going to look like we use anger to conquer it, but that's not really what's happening. I think that what's happening is that we're just upset at our inability and inferiority to be able to do anything about it. Hence, that's the thing that we kind of like immediately shift to as our way to deal with it because we don't know what else to do. And it's just like, man, if that's not an obvious clue as to how dysfunctional that boys like that become, it just goes to show that feeling your emotions is very important in your upbringing. Acting on them all the time is completely nonsense. That's where the line is drawn in between emotional resiliency and toxic masculinity. Emotional resiliency is going to allow you to feel those emotions out and be able to work through them in an effective manner. Toxic masculinity is pretending like those emotions are nothing and then suffering in silence. Being in solitude and suffering in silence are two completely different things. And the thing that makes it different is the context in which you are in isolation. That's all there is to it.
Part of aggression. I heard someone say to me once that at the very heart of aggression is some kind of insecurity. But for men, when they encounter that insecurity, they only know how to sort of manifest it as aggression.
So I wouldn't agree with the first thing, that at the heart of all anger is insecurity, but I would absolutely agree with the second thing, that the only way we know how to respond is with anger. Because
here's the exact quote, just found it. The source of aggression is insecurity. As we are unconsciously aware that our position in life is never secure, people feel increasingly insecure and helpless, so they will be increasingly aggressive and confrontational at a personal and a social level.
So let's tunnel down into that for a second. Okay, so I think that is true on some level, but also I would disagree. So the first thing is that we have parts of our brain, even animals feel anger. But I think that, like, when two dogs are fighting over territory, I don't think that that's born of some kind of identity of insecurity, right? So if we really look at like the evolutionary purpose of anger, this is my opinion, is that anger is the emotion that we feel to protect our territory. It's a protective emotion. So if I slap you across the face, what's the first thing that you're going to feel? It's going to be anger. So if I insult you, you're going to feel angry. It's fascinating the way that it works. So anger causes our thoughts to be faster. Anger causes our peripheral vision to collapse to 30 degrees. So I only see what's in front of me. Yeah. And it also makes me less sensitive to pain. So like my nociceptors will actually like start to be suppressed when I feel angry, right? So if I get into a fight, I'm going to feel it tomorrow, but like while I'm getting hit, I'm not going to feel it.
Fight or flight.
So I don't think it's born of all insecurity. I think anger is simply an evolutionary response. It's something that we experience to protect ourselves. That's why we feel angry, right? So if I attack baby bear, mama bear is going to come out angry. So it's really a protective emotion. Now, I agree with the second part of the statement 100%, that when we feel insecure, especially as men, the only way we are taught to deal with our problems is through anger.
Usually.
Right? So if I'm feeling insecure, if I'm feeling ashamed of myself, if someone's bullying me, what do? I put them in their place. Right? I don't try to make peace. I don't complain to someone because no one's going to take me seriously. Right? I have to stand up for myself.
So we've got the first point there about how we remedy this challenge, which is about self-expression, more self-expression. That's what I heard.
Not self-expression, introspection.
Introspection, getting to know ourselves.
Right? So it's very simple. So if you look at your idea of what it means to be a man.
That's a good job.
What percentage of that idea comes outside of you? And what percentage of that idea comes from within you?
About 90% comes from outside of me.
And that's why 90% of people, we're 90% fucked. Right? So, and if you look, and I'm sure you know this, and you've probably done this too, if you look at where is the goodness in your life, where does it come from, Stephen? It doesn't come from what other people have told you. They may have told you something, but then you looked within yourself and then you found that to be true.
Yeah. Yep.
The goodness in you, the motivation, the really good motivation in you, not chasing things, but the duty that you have, everything that you really strive for, all that good stuff comes from inside you. And the problem is that we live in a world that pulls our attention away from ourselves.
What do you think of Andrew Tateism then?
So as a general rule, I don't comment on people that I don't speak to. Mm-hmm. So tell me the features of what you're talking about.
Okay, so the recent wave of internet masculine influencers who have like Bugattis and lots of women and sports cars, and there's many of them. And they seem to be resonant for some kind of reason, that are kind of saying that the way to be a man is to have loads of money, lots of women, these kind of cars, physical strength. And there's just this huge sort of generation of young, typically men, that are now disciples of that religion.
Yeah. So I think if you dislike that toxic masculinity, what we need to understand is it's the people who hate that toxic masculinity that are driving these people towards it. So I know this is kind of crazy. So what's happened is this has grown, right? And as it's...
I don't think it was necessarily that these are the components that matter. It was just that I know from a lot of Andrew Tate's narrative, it was on the basis of he knew how to appeal to younger boys and teens, adolescents. And in the process of doing so, he knew that he had to break down his success in very elementary ways. He couldn't talk about how good of a businessman he was. He couldn't talk about how he was able to secure assets, whatever. Granted, there's some legal controversies at play. Got it. That's not what I'm talking about, though. And he didn't think it was wise to dive into the business models at play. And because he didn't do that, he decided to take sharp aim at the aesthetic that people can understand and people can gravitate towards as these are the outcomes of what I have done with my efficiency. And but then people digested it as, oh, having these things means this, when not really, when his original pitch was, because I did these things, now look what I have. And that's the common misinterpretation of a lot of it as I've come to understand it.
Grown, what have we done? We've demonized these people. We've said these people are bad. And as we demonize them, what's happened? They've grown stronger. So this is something that's very important to understand. If you are a man and you say, I am suffering today, what is the response that you're going to get?
Shut up.
Absolutely.
Not in those exact words, but that's whatever the words are, that's what they mean.
Now, I want us to be very, very careful, right? So if you are listening to Stephen say people tell you to shut up, and your first thought as a listener is, no, that's not true, that's the problem. So if people agree with you, they understand what you're saying. But if they disagree with you, that's the problem. We literally have a man who is telling us right now that your experiences when I say I'm suffering, people tell you to shut up. And then people are going to be judging you for saying that. And they're going to be saying, no, that's not true.
They're going to be saying, shut up.
Absolutely. Right? So this is exactly the problem. So men are struggling right now, and the rest of the world says, no, you're not. You're privileged. You're a man. There's a patriarchy. And I'm not commenting on the sociology of it. There is a patriarchy, whatever. Men have many advantages in life. I've experienced many advantages of being a man. It's absolutely true. Let's not go there. I'm talking about the individual experience of men. So there is one group of people on the planet who says, yes, your life does suck. And that's these toxic masculine people. They're the only people that truly validate men's experiences. Because everyone else says, why are you complaining? And these guys say, yeah, you're a fucking loser. What are you going to do about it? They at least meet you where you're at. And they say, yes, your life is hard, and I will show you a way to make it better. Whereas the rest of the world says, no, your life isn't hard. What are you complaining about? And I've seen this as a doctor. I've seen patients who are complaining about pain, women who are complaining about pain because they have...
I would say that there's biological advantages to being a man, and I think that the world will naturally perceive that a man will do more in a certain occupation. But to say that you have all these advantages from being a man, I think he's just catering to a certain audience that he's built up over the years. I think that to say that that's not the case or that there isn't a justified reason to complain. My point behind it is, if you want to complain, sure. If you want to complain about being a man, sure. But just know that means nothing and that does nothing for you. To know that you are suffering is a matter of you realizing certain inferiorities in your life. And then that's probably the best way to approach the person that is suffering, is like, well, what's causing you to suffer? And is it within your control, or is it not within your control? If it is within your control, then what are you doing about it, right? And that's the whole point of meeting them at that point. And then if it's outside of your control, you need to understand that these are things that you need to let go. And you have to understand that your ability to be sustainable will counterbalance the chaos of the things that you can't control.
An internal bleed within the wall of their uterus that cannot get detected. And they're saying, I'm hurting, and we ignore this person's pain. And that's when things go bad. So for years and years and years, we have ignored the struggles of men. And there's one group on the planet who accepts them with open arms. And the more that we demonize them, so when someone starts believing in this toxic masculinity, what is the response? Do people ever ask, like, Help me understand what your life is like. Like, what do you like about this person? Because everyone's going to them for a reason, but we never bother to ask, why are you listening to this person? What does this mean to you? We see these posts all the time in our community. My boyfriend is getting into this stuff. My son is getting this stuff. How do I stop it? Hold on a second. Don't try to stop it. Understand it first. Because everyone's trying to stop it and no one is bothering to listen to what the experience of these men are. And that's why it's getting worse and worse and worse as we try to stop it.
So if I'm the mother of a son who is watching a lot of these sort of toxic male influences online, what would be a better approach versus just banning the computer and telling them that that's toxic and not to look at it?
Help me understand what you like about this. What is it like to be a man in today's day and age? How do you feel about yourself? How does it feel knowing that 70 to 80% of women want you to make more money than them, and yet 60% of people who graduate from college are women? So men are living in a world today where there are impossible expectations to meet. And
that goes directly against his pitch of the advantages that he was talking about from being a man. Exactly my point.
Like, what is it like to be someone who fundamentally has no chance at success? Right? These are the kinds of things that you need to say to these people. You need to give them an alternate place to go where they can be heard and helped, supported, and understood. See, anytime we make a judgment, our mind already has a conclusion. There's nothing left to learn anytime we're judgmental. So what do we do to all these people who are toxic?
Well, judgments can also be assessments, though. They don't have to be final. We can gauge where we are based on a performance, and that can be a judgment of our performance in that time period. But then we also know that this is just a milestone of our performance. It's not definitive of our entire lives.
Men, we even create the word toxic. We literally label them as bad in some way. And I'm not saying that the behavior isn't toxic. But what I'm trying to point out is that even in our language, there is so much harsh judgment. So I once had a patient.
We both just did it, didn't we?
Absolutely. So I once had a patient who was smearing feces all over the school. So adolescent kid, right? And when you have a kid who's literally taking a shit and wiping it on the walls and stuff, what happens? The kid gets punished. Kid gets punished again and again and again. The one really sad thing is no one ever asks, why are you doing this? What's going on inside you? Because healthy kids don't do this. It's only kids who've been traumatized in some way. And as I've worked with incels, as I've worked with people who are toxically masculine.
Because a lot of the issues that you can find in children as to why they're led astray is because of environmental context. Some of it is genetic context. In other words, it's like hereditary from DNA and chromosomes. But a lot of it is environmental context. And it's why that a lot of women have some pretty hard upbringings as well. Because they had abusive childhoods, and abusive childhoods on women impact women in the long term much more than it impacts men for a few different reasons. One, because women can often find a sense of compassion more often than men, and I think that kind of attributes to why men have to learn how to just deal with it. It was kind of the narrative that we hear a lot in this video, whereas women tend to find more community platforms because they're more naturally social. Not only are they more naturally social, but they're more inviting. They're more inclusive naturally. It's just biologically speaking.
It always starts with trauma. And when I say always, this is a clinical experience, but I'm talking about 100%. So 100% of people start on this path by getting hurt in some way, by getting taken advantage of in some way, by sacrificing something and not getting something in return. And they have their share of responsibility too. I'm not saying that they're hapless victims, but I think that people who are raised with love and compassion and do have connections don't go down this road.
You're so passionate about this, aren't you? Because I feel like your eyes have seen in your practice some pretty heartbreaking things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
this
like
is life. Of course.
See, unless we are willing to be what these people need, they're going to continue going down the toxic masculinity route. Someone needs to start offering these people safe haven. No matter what they say, or not no matter, I think there should be consequences for actions. But so this is as someone who's worked in a jail, right? So and this is what's kind of interesting if you really think about it. People will judge me for talking to or even trying to support people who are toxically masculine. And they're like, oh my God, you're such an asshole. You're giving these people a platform. How could you make the world a worse place? And then I tell them I worked in a jail for 3 months, and they're like, oh, look at you. You're so compassionate. You're working with these people who are like criminals. And like, oh my God. I don't think they realize that anyone you see on social media is 10 times better than the people that I worked with in jail. These are people who are actual pedophiles, actual rapists, right? Not just talking about it. Maybe the people on social media are too. I don't know. And so it's really interesting the way that our mind automatically judges things. And so if we really want to fix this problem, and I think we need to fix this problem, it's just my take. I mean, I'm not I'm a big fan of like compassion and trying to support other human beings. I'm not saying that that's always the right answer. I think sometimes you may need things like war or violence or whatever. I mean, there may be causes for it. But generally speaking, I think that like demonizing these people isn't working.
Is there anything else that we haven't covered in the remedies to this sort of male crisis? We've talked about getting more in touch with yourselves. Is there anything else? Do we need more positive role models, or is it really not about the external at all?
No, I mean, so I think all that stuff is true. So we know that, for example, like there's like a loneliness crisis and things like that. I think that it's not just role models. Like we need.
The most impactful individual is a biological father. Next step down is a non-biological father. Outside of that, it is a male coach. And then it goes into feminine influence.
Individual responsibility. So like, for example, everyone will say, yeah, like I know it's a real tragedy that men don't have friends, but it's not my job to fix. I will hear this from both men and women, that like it's a real tragedy, but it's not my responsibility. It's sad that this thing happened, but it's not my which makes sense, right? No human being is responsible for another human being. But then the question kind of becomes like, okay, let's play that tape through to the end. What happens to that person? Whose responsibility is it? So if you look at a lot of what's going on with men right now, it's loneliness, it's isolation, it's touch starvation, it's suicidality.
Sexlessness as well.
Sexlessness. And it's no individual person's responsibility. But the real problem with this is that these are not problems that men can solve on their own. This is exactly why this is the problem that men are experiencing. Because as men, we are taught to be independent. We are taught to be, you should fix everything on your own. And so men have fixed all of the things that we can fix on our own. The only thing that's left is the things that we must rely on other people for, right? So no one's complaining about, I mean, a lot of men are obese, but there's not like an obesity, there is a crisis, but that's not what's bothering people. That's not where we're losing the war. We're not losing the war on baldness, right? So there are lots of things as a man that you can fix in your own life. It's just the real challenge is that no one is willing to take responsibility for any level of connection with men. And so that's not something that is going to get fixed because you need another.
Well, I would argue that obesity doesn't influence the law of attraction, and it's the law of attraction that makes it more likely to conduct yourself in a more compassionate behavior towards men that aren't obese. I think that there's an argument there that needs to be had too, and that's why health matters, because obesity obviously leads to a lot of different insecurities as well.
For a human being to hug you. Like you can't hug yourself. It just doesn't work. So and my area of focus tends to be on introspection because I think that's like really, really powerful, but there's all kinds of other stuff that's important. Mentorship, role models, all that kind of stuff. But I think ultimately through introspection, you can attain complete peace, no matter who you are, what your path is, circumstances. I think it's kind of like the silver bullet, which is what the Buddha discovered.
So are you saying that as a society, we should take on more of the responsibility for some of these big fundamental issues that men and people in crisis can't solve for themselves?
Subtly, no. Not a society. Because as a society, who's part? No. I mean you. I mean, your listeners as individuals need to take responsibility. And it's not that you have to take responsibility. It's not fair to you to be responsible for someone else. But unless everyone who is listening to this podcast goes out and literally hugs a man, no one else is going to do it. Because if you don't do it, who's going to do it? You can't rely on society. We've been relying on society to fix the problem. It's not working. Society can't do shit.
So you're saying me?
Me,
forget
yes.
Society. Don't wait for government to have some kind of intervention.
How's it working out?
Not great.
So that was Dr. K and Steve from Diary of a CEO, and the overall pitch is that there's a lot of justified dislike for people like Andrew Tate and people from that area of social media. The one thing that I'll say is the message. Here's what's wrong with the message. It comes from a good place. It's delivered poorly, And the variables of the message are often very shallow and misinformed, because to stand on a platform that, hey, you as a man have different disparities that you're going to have to address and that you're going to have to figure out as you grow up, I think that's very important. I think pulling the veil on that reality is very important, because it allows you to know that although these things can be unfair, guess what? That's the storm that you need to weather. Now, to say that by the way to balance or the way to counterbalance is by having all these things, you need these things in order to counterbalance, I think that's the bullshit, right? I think that's where it falls off. Like, you have to have these fancy cars in order to achieve a sense of good feeling. It's like, no, you need to have all these women in order to achieve a sense of meaning. No, like there's several different things to it that fall by the wayside, because that is completely irrelevant to your success of your introspection. And I think introspection was a very key point that Dr. K put forward, because that is something that I put forward a little bit ago, or more a while ago at this point, in regards to achieving your own sense of sustainability. Now, you'll always hear me use the word sustainability, because it's essentially the term to be able to walk the path through chaos and achieve what's on the other side, despite not knowing what's on the other side. Because often when we pursue a better version of self, we don't always know what that looks like until we start making moves and steps in that direction. And I think that that's really, really important for men and women, for that matter, just in our own unique ways. I think that that's very important. And I think that there's a bridge that needs to be gapped between these movements of, this is how you achieve masculinity and this is how you achieve masculinity. I think that there's a conducive message that can be drawn from both. And if we're wise enough, and if we conduct enough introspection to find out, then we'll probably be able to pull the variables from these messages ourselves in a way that it makes sense to us, and we conducting ourselves less in an externalizing matter, because looking outward doesn't do anything. It doesn't. We need to look inward. And I think that this is a perfect example of a conversation between two men trying to achieve that. So with that being said, thank you for watching the video. If you liked the video, give it a like. If you appreciate the content so far, please consider subscribing. If you dislike the video, then dislike it. Hopefully you never see me again. But go ahead and comment in the comment section down below for any of your thoughts on this problem as a whole. Obviously, we've covered very similar topics across the channel. This is the first Diary of a CEO content that we've ever covered. Very interesting conversation. But I'm always curious to hear the thoughts of my viewers, anyone that watches my content. So with that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll go ahead and see you next time.